Hi, I'm Steve Cull, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to New America and to this book talk with a couple of friends of our institution and prolific authors and thinkers. Just to set the stage for you, we are webcasting live, and so when the time comes for your questions and comments, please wait for the microphone, identify yourself, and try to be concise, and also be aware that it would be a good time to silence your devices that you may have with you. What we'll do is I'm just going to briefly introduce the co-authors, and then they're going to do their Mutt and Jeff show that they've now been out on the road rehearsing, and then I'll come back up and maybe ask one or two questions, and then we'll turn to you. So Zach Karabell is a member of our board of directors and I think has written 9 books before this one. And really an eclectic thinker, has a doctoral degree from Harvard, previously served as senior executive and chief economist at the Alger Asset Management Group. He's now the president of River Twice Research, which is a consulting research and asset management firm in New York. And his co-author, Aron Cramer, is the president and CEO of Business for Social Responsibility, which has been an innovator in updating the social responsibility movement, I think, over the last 5 years, and particularly connecting it to emerging thinking about sustainability and natural resource constraints, as well as transparency and the emergence of digital technology as a factor in global corporate life. And I think from their shared interests in the rapid changes in the landscape in which corporations operate, they collaborated on this book. Actually, I hope you'll say something about where the book actually came from, as well as what it contains. And so we'll let them talk for about 20 minutes or so, and then we will interrogate them further. Which one of you sings the opening number?
Usually you do.
I do, yeah.
Okay.
My superior singing voice, I guess. Thanks, Steve.
Actually, we don't need that because we have these.
Oh, good point.
Oh, all right.
Thanks, Steve.
Take that back.
Well, Steve, your invitation to talk about where the book came from is a logical and I hope a good place to start. For me, the rise of corporate responsibility, sustainability over the last quarter century really has been one of the most interesting developments, certainly in business. It's changed the way a lot of business people think. Companies now almost look a little bit like governments in some ways. They've got environment ministries, they've got ministries of foreign relations, and are thinking about their interaction with the world that used to be considered outside business in a different way. And I think in a 21st century world where you've got the miniaturization of almost everything, the notion that big government handles what it does, big business does what it does, big media, you remember big media, does what it does, it doesn't really work anymore. And so companies are now thinking about a set of questions like human rights, like climate, like water, transparency certainly, that they weren't a generation ago. And I think this is really exciting, and it in some ways is a bottom-up reshaping of the social contract in some ways. And so we're trying to tell that story and look ahead a bit. We're really hoping to reach 2 main audiences with 1 point each. First is mainstream business audience, to make the case that this isn't about companies being better, being more ethical, being more moral, although certainly there is a dimension of that. But our view is that mainstreaming attention to these issues is actually a crucial dimension, and in some ways the crucial dimension in companies' ability to develop a smart strategy and one that they can actually put into action. And there's been a lot of progress there, but we wanted to write a book that didn't make the moral case, but rather made the case that this is a strategic imperative for business. For those who are already converted, we also wanted to flip thinking a little bit to demonstrate how sustainability is an opportunity, and it is probably going to be one of the most important means of putting innovation into action over the coming quarter century or indeed half century. And we talk in the book about building business strategies around big global questions, and there are a lot of exciting things happening. We'll talk about some examples. Some companies that are often associated with this these days, Nike and Walmart, Google, and some companies that haven't been so much, Best Buy, who are asking, how can we take the energy challenge, the water challenge, the changing expectations of the millennial generation, and turn that into an engine of creativity. And we're seeing lots of examples of that happen. And so we don't want people to think about this as a way to manage risk, but rather as a way to catalyze opportunity. So those are the two audiences we're hoping to reach, and that's if that happens, then the book will have served its intended purpose.
So the way this all came about in part was, I mean, Aron has a long 15-year career focusing on these issues, focusing on how businesses have dealt with sustainability, and even in that period of time, the way in which these issues have migrated from the periphery to the core of how a lot of businesses operate is dramatic. I came into this a little bit later from an asset management perspective, where I created a green fund at an asset a mutual fund, and partly piggybacking on the zeitgeist shifting in 2006, 2007, largely because of Al Gore's film An Inconvenient Truth, which simply catalyzed a lot of concerns that were out there, but then it became a media phenomenon and a public focus. And, you know, I thought about these things somewhat, how they've evolved over the past 30 years, so that if you look at the notion of businesses thinking about sustainability or thinking about the environment or thinking about how they're interacting with local communities and labor and supply chains, you know, most of those things were either externalities for businesses, and to some degree things like the price of carbon still is. And then there was people who really felt that business needed to address the environmental consequences, the labor consequences, all the things that we think about as core to sustainability. When that consciousness started developing in the 1970s, it was really oppositional to business. And so things like Earth Day and Greenpeace evolving as organizations or ideas or movements that were going to force business to do things differently, that were going to force business to attend to these or raise the pressure on them and the pain. But business was really seen as a negative or oppositional force. And then you started to have a few early movers or people who thought of creating different business models that were more in sync with this value system. Companies like Ben & Jerry's and Stonyfield Farms Yogurt and Burt's Bees and Body Shop in England and Timberland and Patagonia, all of which were created by visionary leaders who thought, we're going to do business differently. We're going to bring concerns for environment, sustainability, and resources into the heart of our operating. And we don't spend a lot of time focusing on those in the book because in many ways that's a different model than what a lot of larger companies and smaller companies are dealing with today, which is how do you deal with the cost structure that a world of rising input costs is creating? And how do you maintain profitability in a world of incredible global growth but much lower global price points? Meaning, you know, if you're any company dealing with any of these issues, you're faced with vastly rising input costs and an inability to pass those on to customers. And that's a huge incentive to become more efficient and to use less inputs, use less stuff, which does reduce your carbon footprint, but isn't being driven by the same, as Aron talked about, moral vision of what's right, the way the Yves Chouinard or Ben & Jerry's founded their businesses with that at the kind of the core of their corporate mandate. Although those were incredibly important as a kind of early stage for all of this. And oddly enough, the book idea for the two of us came, we were doing a project in, of all places, in Dubai, because before the financial collapse in 2008, one of Dubai's goals was to become the most sustainable city in the world by 2015. Now, how they were going to do that while simultaneously building ski lifts in the middle of the desert was anybody's guess. But we thought, as a project that BSR and that we could contribute to, it certainly would have been an interesting challenge to try to help the Emirate of Dubai become a more sustainable city.
Turns out it took an infusion of cash from Abu Dhabi
to make it a more sustainable city. And of course, the irony being, in Abu Dhabi, you have one of the great global experiments right now of sustainability in building what is currently price tagged at $30 billion, the city of Masdar, which is supposed to be a carbon-neutral, zero-footprint city for 50,000 people. We also talked a bit to Masdar at around that time, and we're reflecting on the fact that Masdar's officials might want to think about, while building a carbon-neutral city, if you go to their headquarters, there's also a line of escalades with the engines running and the air conditioner full blast, so that when Sheikh X, Y, and Z come out from their meetings to build the carbon-neutral city, have cold internal combustion engines to whisk them away to their ski lifts. But I digress. So we thought, well, if we're not going to be able to make Dubai into a sustainable development future, we could at least write a book about how companies are dealing with these issues. So,
tough act to follow. And this was in 2008, and there's actually, it in some ways could have been considered the absolute wrong time to write this book. There were a lot of people 2 years ago, as we were all watching the tickers go south every second, thinking that sustainability actually would prove to have been a relic from the time when the economy was strong and markets were all pointing in the right direction. And the fact is, that's not at all what's happened. And while in Washington that getting national policy here on climate has proved to be very, very difficult, while the public is indeed focused on paycheck to paycheck, that in fact businesses have not only maintained their convictions on sustainability, they've extended them. And just this week, you see examples of this from KKR, one of the biggest private equity firms that's now working with the Environmental Defense Fund to screen their investments. Google, which is getting into the energy transmission business, not just with a big new project on the Atlantic seabed, and lots of other examples. So it was the dog that didn't bark, and in fact, I think it ratifies our assumptions that in fact sustainability would be one of the things that would help companies compete, not just make a better world, but actually make better companies. And so the evolution of thinking, I think, has really sunk roots in a way that it hadn't before. What we try to do in the book is tell some stories about how this thinking has evolved, and I think Nike is a perfect illustration of how things have worked. Across town in, I think, 1997 or 98, Phil Knight, the company's founder, gave a speech at the National Press Club where he said, correctly, that Nike had come to be the poster child for all of the evils of the global economy. And indeed, that was the case. Nike was seeing it in all of the polling data it did of its consumers. It was really concerned that teens and young adults, the core market, were turning against them. And they realized they had to pay attention to issues they hadn't paid attention to before, particularly labor issues. So what did they do? They came up with compliance models. They tried to say, we need to make sure that we're following the rules, following the laws, and we're going to put out an army of people around the world to do that. And so that was phase 2, going from, if not denial, then I think by their own admission, a degree of ignorance, to saying we're going to put structures in place. We're going to, in essence, we're going to privatize labor inspections within our supply chain. And take that approach, and they moved quickly, fairly effectively, and they learned something along the way, that actually Nike is not a company that looks to police factories. Nike, in its heart and soul, sees itself as an engine of innovation. It's very passionate about competing, going further. You know their slogans, there is no finish line, and things like that. That's baked into the DNA of the company. And so over the last few years, there's been a phase 3, which I think represents where most companies who are thinking seriously about this are aiming to go, which is this creative force. How can we redesign our business? And in Nike's case, actually literally redesigning their shoes to come up with closed-loop manufacturing, no waste, minimal use of water, minimal use of energy, very few toxics, if any, in the glue. They're phasing all of these things out. They're looking to do product innovation. The jerseys that were worn by the Nike-sponsored teams in the World Cup were made out of discarded plastic water bottles. And by the way, they performed really, really well, because at Nike you don't make a product if it's not going to perform. They've actually set targets in terms of having trade unions in their factories. This is something that's been a big taboo in the apparel and footwear world. So what you see now is an approach to sustainability that is premised on innovation, is led from the top. Mark Parker, the CEO, has really embraced this because he knows that the company's ongoing growth is in emerging markets, and there's going to be a big crash into a brick wall if American consumption levels are exported or adopted in emerging markets. Of course, these days it seems that American consumption models aren't working so well in America either, but that's a story for another lunchtime, I think. And so Nike has really changed its thinking, and in phase 3 of its approach, I think it exemplifies a lot of what we talk about in the book. Tackle big global challenges, look to innovate, set audacious targets, be really transparent about what you're doing, and try to bring consumers along with you, because if consumers start to get excited about some of these things, it stimulates demand and creates a virtuous circle that allows Nike and others to go even further. So they've gone from being the avatar of everything that's wrong with the global economy to everything that, I wouldn't say is right, but is potentially right with the global economy. And that's what businesses do. Businesses like to create things, and if you can align that creative spirit with some of the challenges that we face on sustainability, then I think business is making a really solid contribution that enables all of us to go a lot further.
So on this fusion of sustainability and innovation and sustainability and leadership is particularly potent post-2008. And that, I think, is striking to us, given that when we thought about writing this, we couldn't have known that. Some of it is just the fortuitous convergence of factors in the moment, meaning if you didn't have hugely rising input costs based on the emergence of China, India, et cetera, combined with the collapse of a lot of the new capital spending that was going to bring a lot of new supply of raw materials online, you wouldn't necessarily have this enhanced corporate imperative to reduce costs and move in a more sustainable direction and have an incentive to spend money on the innovation to do so. It's the convergence of those factors in the time that we are now that has meant that all of these issues, rather than being peripheral to the core operations of business, or something that you do because you don't want to deal with the PR consequences of someone labeling you badly, have instead become central to anybody thinking about how do I run a sustainable business, one that is both profitable and deals with the supply chain of resources and labor. And so you have this across company and company and company, and it's become, I think, sort of a ubiquitous global phenomenon that in many ways is much more heartening, with the caveats of none of these are perfect, right? But more heartening than the awareness that things like global climate talks at Copenhagen have collapsed, the awareness of there's not going to be an energy bill with a price of carbon in the United States in the foreseeable future. But on the flip side of that, you have companies saying, look, we've got to deal with the world that we're in. We've got to operate in the world we're in, irrespective of those limitations. And so you have companies like Shell, which Aron has done a lot of work with over the past years, has basically set a price of carbon simply because they need to operate efficiently in a world, regardless of whether or not governments do that. And they literally have said, I think it's at $40.
They don't say, but that's close.
I have no idea what the price is that they set, but apparently they set something around $40. And you have company after company doing this because the imperatives of the marketplace are forcing them to. And that's not a statement about, the market will solve everything, but it's an interesting moment where those forces are proving to be forcing solutions much more than most governments are able to do in the world we're in today. And the innovation cycle is fascinating too, because it's not just the innovation of products and Nike doing cool jerseys with recycled material or trying to do closed loop. It's also the innovation of systems and the innovation of strategy, both of which we talk about in the book. And you have a company like IBM, which in many ways, in its structure, is the perfect iteration of these transformations. So 20 years ago, IBM is primarily a closed-loop hardware manufacturer. And today, IBM has become, in most respects, a global software and solutions consulting company to large companies to help them rationalize their supply chain, become more efficient, and reduce their resource consumption, because that helps them be more efficient. And that's why IBM's entire image as it markets itself is in terms of smarter cities, smarter planet, and it's all green advertising, right? But it's not because Big Blue has really become Big Green in its sense of what's morally right. It's that that's the most potent business opportunity of helping rationalize supply chains, making these things more efficient, reducing inventories. Same thing for a company like SAP. Google has its own version of that. And I think that formula is proving to be very potent. There's also, and Aron can talk about this now, fascinating shifting alliances. So you've gone from the 70s where NGOs and alternate business models were very much in tension and friction with established businesses to a period of time today where everyone has essentially become more pragmatic about how to solve problems and address these issues. And that's led to a real shifting of the sands when it comes to who works with whom.
Yeah, I mean, no one would have guessed, I think, 20 years ago and maybe even 5 years ago that EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund, would have an office in Bentonville, Arkansas. It's not just because property taxes are low in Bentonville. There's a reason why they have an office there, and it's called Walmart. And as Walmart has entered into this game, they've decided that they want and need to work with organizations like that, NGOs, and you see all sorts of interesting and in some ways strange bedfellows, and there's some great anecdotes about how this all works. Coca-Cola and Greenpeace have actually become product development partners, and Greenpeace, which takes a fairly oppositional view towards business in a variety of contexts, realized that their Germany chapter realized that there was a factory in the former East Germany that had some great ability to produce refrigeration. The factory could be retooled to create a refrigerator that would produce significantly less environmental impact. Well, Greenpeace's ability to do that and take it to market is somewhat limited. Coca-Cola is pretty good at taking things to market. And so they, after a number of twists and turns, joined forces, and at the Beijing Olympics in 2008, you had these joint venture refrigerators, in a sense, being presented and pushed into the marketplace. And in some ways, on the face of it, it sounds absurd that you'd have Coca-Cola and Greenpeace working to create products together, but that's exactly what's happening. Now, the world, there are complex layers to all of this, and if you were to ask people at Nestle about Greenpeace, you might get a different response. Nestle was the subject earlier this year of an episode that I think was very telling. Greenpeace produced a mock commercial for the Kit Kat bar, and it showed an office worker taking an afternoon break, opening up the Kit Kat bar, and finding orangutan fingers inside not chocolate, and bit in, and, well, blood ensues. I won't go any further than that. It's really gruesome. And it made its way around the world very fast, and there was no media buy involved. It's called YouTube. So YouTube was a vehicle for this. So Greenpeace, the same organization that's creating refrigerators with Coca-Cola, is putting this out, and it sparked a really serious row with Nestle. And I think a lot of people believe, and we tell the story in the book, that Nestle actually misunderstood viral media and sort of heaped more kindling onto the fire and kept it going and so on. Didn't work out that well for them. It worked out beautifully for Greenpeace. They were quite pleased with it. And this is the next wave that's happening, because what the Greenpeace story illustrates is you've got NGOs that actually have really great technical capacity to do things, not just make philosophical statements, do things on the one hand. On the other hand, the leverage that happens is now actually, to use that old 1999 term, being disintermediated, because anyone could have created this video. Actually, it didn't take Greenpeace To borrow from a great book, Clay Shirky wrote a book a few years ago, Organizing Without Organization, or Here Comes Everybody, Organizing Without Organizations. This is what's happening. So you've got these mega organizations that can do things, and then you've got shifting networks that I think are poised to have the same level of impact, frankly, that the rise of the internet had in the mid to late 90s. And it's no coincidence that companies started paying more attention to corporate responsibility at the same time that the internet magically appeared in our laps. The transparency revolution is, I think, a huge driver of all of this and something that's making a big difference.
So a couple more things and we're going to finish up. One, by the way, the reason for that was that for the Nestle and Greenpeace issue was that Nestle had, through one of its suppliers, sourced some of the palm oil that goes into a Kit Kat bar in an area of New Guinea that was one of the last remaining orangutan habitats in the world. And so that was it wasn't Nestle itself, it was a source. The book is partly about the way companies are dealing with the environmental and resource challenges. It also includes labor, and it includes sort of supply chains writ large. And it's a global phenomenon. It's not just U.S. and European companies. Weirdly enough, Chinese companies are, in many ways, much more aggressively moving ahead on things like labor issues and some of their impact. It's also, it's not just large companies. It's companies that are developing models in light of these realities. So one of which we talk about is, it's a fairly global but not huge company called Autodesk that makes three-dimensional imaging systems for high-end commercial and other architecture. And one of the things they have been aggressively doing is helping building designers develop energy-efficient buildings in mock-up, along with material costs. Very complicated programs that allow for much greater efficiencies and cost savings. And it's a model that obviously speaks to the time we're in, but it's a business model that is sort of inconceivable unless we were in the moment we're in. And I think that, too, there's a lot to be sort of hopeful about. I mean, we are hopeful about the shape of these things, while certainly cautious of, we don't know how these things are going to play themselves out. If suddenly resources were to drop in price, and there are all sorts of things that could offset these issues. But there's a lot of stories going on sort of beneath the radar, because we're not really used to talking about how business deals with global problems. It's not the way in which we're accustomed to speaking of these things. And so I guess a final thought is, when we thought about what this book might be in 10 years, what would sustainable excellence be? Because we talk about what are the criteria of sustainable excellence. And they're not hard and fast. They're not cookie cutters. They're sort of principles. Aron's talked about innovation and strategy and leadership and product innovation. But that the hope really would be that these ideas will become so embedded in how anyone does business that there's no separate category of sustainable excellence. There's just excellence. And that how one manages an excellent business is part and parcel of these characteristics that for now are still somewhat new and different. And that hopefully these become so ubiquitous that there's no category to write about as a separate category. So that's the hope. I'm not sure we have great conviction that will be the case in 10 years, but maybe.
Great optimism.
Great optimism.
Well, thank you both very much for that. And someday my excellence will include an ability to turn this microphone on, but in the meantime I need assistance. And I also should have said at the beginning that there are books outside, and as trenchant as that talk was, it cannot possibly substitute the reading experience.
It really can't. I mean, the reading experience itself is so
book
special.
It's also
and
intimate. It's a kind of form of sustainability of the soul.
Absolutely,
really, reading is.
The book reads itself. So,
yeah. So, Rebecca, I want to invite you into this in a second to talk a little bit about where Aron was ending up about transparency, because I know you're working on really the next generation of corporate responsibility issues around digital privacy and the management of the political space that the internet presents, and I want to hear from you about that. But while you're thinking about your 1-minute intervention, Aron, I wanted to ask you, a lot of what you've said has addressed a version of the question I wanted to ask, but I wanted to draw you further into detail. If I were an unsentimental chief executive of a global 2,000 corporation, publicly traded, I would certainly be attentive to my fiduciary duty to my shareholders and to my owners. And so I would address your arguments through the filter of thinking why. And I would very quickly get to the efficiency argument that you make, because even the most unsentimental global oil corporations embrace that before they embraced climate science. It's a consensus builder. I hear also brand positioning, and through brand positioning, the pursuit of market share. I'm learning about my customers' attitudes towards my products, and what I'm learning is they need me to position myself in reference to these sustainability issues. So that's a competitive imperative. Now you're making Zach ended up with an even deeper argument that the very process of becoming sustainable will create a virtuous culture inside my corporation. I'm not sentimental enough to believe that, but I'm interested in the proposition. But what other material benefits can you promise me that I could deliver to my shareholders as a result of embracing these principles? Will I recruit more talent? What other kinds of things am I missing on my list of reasons why this will create real measurable shareholder value?
It's a great question. I think you hit on a lot of key elements, and one of the tricks in all of this is delivering shareholder value within what time period. So will it deliver in the next quarter? The answer is typically not, although I would argue that very few things, there are very few levers that any CEO can push that will actually make that happen, and I think recent experience suggests that when that's the time frame, actually we all lose, including the CEO over time. So attracting people is hugely important. I've heard this from companies like Shell, like Gap, that when they're in trouble, they can't recruit. It's very simple, they can't recruit, and that's absolutely crucial. I touched on innovation, product innovation earlier. I think that's a big part of it. There's some other things as well. One is the trust dimension, and that's not just an academic or intangible thing. I mean, it's brand reputation, but let's face it, when the people from Detroit came down here to talk to Congress, they did not have a deep reservoir of trust on which to draw in order to get the support. When they flew, yeah, I used the generic "came down here," but yeah, their bikes were in the shop, they didn't have much trust to draw upon, and that made a real difference. And part of the reason that they didn't is they had been almost without exception coming to Washington to lobby against increases in cafe standards. So a lot of people said, well, you're here because of your own decisions and your own actions. Why should we help you? So that actually is crucial. There's another piece that has to do with emerging markets, and it's true for every company really, that's where the growth opportunities are. And I mentioned earlier, at least in passing, I think you choose your study, but it's clear that we need anywhere from 3 to 6 planets in order to take American living standards to the rest of the world, and that's where the most growth opportunities are. I always like to say I live in Berkeley, California. I see a lot of people on a given day who think there are 3 or 6 planets that we can use, but I'm not in that camp. So I think that's it, and a lot of companies from Walmart to GE to smaller ones are trying to change the approach, including the design process. So Unilever, and I had a chance to participate in a design charrette in India with Unilever, where they brought in design students to figure out, well, how can we capture water better so that our factories can continue to operate in India? Those solutions aren't designed very well in London. They're designed quite well in India, actually, and I think that's another top-line opportunity that appeals.
Great, that's great, thank you. Here, Rebecca, why don't you take mine, and just say a little bit, as you did this morning, about this frontier in business responsibility.
Sure, well, it's making funny noises, I don't know why.
Maybe,
Sorry?
It's on now.
It's on, but it's silenced. I don't know. I'll put it down.
Yeah, maybe it's.
Anyway, maybe that's not it. Anyway, I'll just hold it far away from myself. That seems to help. Actually, I just want to point out, just first of all, that Aron and his organization have played actually a very important role in some of the issues I'm working on. The BSR and Aron's colleagues played a key facilitating role in setting up something called the Global Network Initiative, which I'm also a founding member of, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative aimed at setting some baseline principles for free expression and privacy for the internet and telecommunications sector, and getting companies to work with a set of human rights organizations, academics, and socially responsible investors to figure out how both to engage in lots of different complicated markets where governments are making all kinds of demands that violate free expression and privacy in various ways, still engage in those markets, but not basically engage in a race to the bottom. Because what we're seeing is, of course, that not only in China, which was sort of in the news a great deal this year, but in a lot of countries, internet companies, telecommunications companies are coming under pressure from governments to comply with surveillance requests and to censor what their users are doing in ways that arguably violate core ideas of human rights and that are harmful to kind of the general human rights free expression environment in a range of countries, arguably. And what's been difficult in this arena, I mean, it's really only since 2004, 2005 that free expression and privacy have begun to be spoken about, at least in the socially responsible investment community and the CSR community, as being part of corporate social responsibility. And beyond sort of Google, Yahoo, and Microsoft, who kind of got dragged into this because they got yelled at in Congress a few times, it's been really difficult getting other companies to publicly recognize that they have issues and responsibilities, and that, you know, that what your product is in many ways depends on public trust, and the best way to gain public trust in a global marketplace is to make commitments that you're going to at least not sell people out at the first opportunity to various governments or other interests, and make public commitments to upholding people's rights, and that's been, you know, a very difficult struggle.
If you accept her observation, why is it so? And is there in the emerging social contract between multinationals and global citizens or activists, is there a kind of natural life cycle by which the Bill of Rights expands in the face of initial resistance, or are there some issues like this one that are never going to be part of the compact?
You know, I mean, I think it's interesting in that, like everything else, the answer lies in these shades of gray rather than the blacks and whites, and a lot of what went on between Google and China in the early part of the year, and which is, in many respects, still going on. It's just not, I mean, you know a lot about this, but it's not part of the public discussion the way it was in the first 3-4 months of the year, is very indicative of that. So on the transparency side or on the reputational side, anything any company does, if it's a global organization anywhere in the world, is going to be public knowledge everywhere in the world. So there's you can't just do what government X in country Y wants you to do and then do something completely different in country Z without that disjuncture becoming immediately evident and potentially problematic. But at the same time, you also have to respect that different countries, different cultures have different litmuses. And so, you know, companies are left with this, what's the mean that we can negotiate? And I think people, you know, around the Google issue, for instance, legitimately said it's a little disingenuous to say Google's standing up against censorship in China when the reality is in 27 other countries there is censorship of different sorts of things, you know, whether it's in the Gulf or Germany around Nazis. I mean, it's trying to find that line. We do write about in the book, too, that technology companies, when they deal with sustainability, have one kind of really problematic liability at their heart, which is a culture of intense secrecy about their own intellectual property that can become a culture of intense secrecy about how they're doing things. The irony being these are the companies creating the means of transmission of open expression that themselves have tended to have extremely paranoid cultures about anyone knowing the secrets of their intellectual property. And that can infect the way a lot of these companies actually do business and interact. And that can be a problem. And we talk about Apple being an unbelievably innovative company, but also problematic on this score. So that's not, I don't think there's a clear answer to what you're talking about, other than there's not a clear answer to what you're talking about.
I think the delay, you can think about this in two separate ways. A lot of companies have made a lot of commitments because there's been an absence of government action on things that they and the public seem to want. So, and let's take China as an example. There's an absence of health and safety law enforcement in China, and companies have stepped into that space, fairly willingly after some initial resistance, because there the action is additive. It's actually making the government look better than it deserves to look. Now you take free expression, whether in China or elsewhere, it's entirely different. This is about companies being asked to step in to do things that the government has actively said they don't want to have happen within their jurisdiction. And that's a horse of a different color, to use an old Chinese proverb.
Could I just ask a really quick follow-up? Do you think, it took a long time for companies to come to acknowledge their responsibilities on sustainability and environment, and it required a really diverse and widespread global movement to get it to that point. And do you think that's what it's going to really take? Just much more civil society awareness and engagement, much broader public discussion and awareness of these kinds of issues before companies really recognize their responsibilities or possible responsibilities in this area?
So, I think there are probably four ingredients. There's public pressure, there's consumer demand, there's opportunity that companies see, and there's public regulation. And ideally, all four of those oars are in the water going in the same direction. As you say, and you're absolutely right, whenever mindsets change, it's either because there's a light bulb that goes on or someone starts beating you over the head. And I think companies got into this not because, with some very visible exceptions, not because the light bulb necessarily went on, but a lot of public pressure made a huge difference. And I think each leap forward, you see that. On free expression, which you know very well, the folks at Human Rights Watch, amongst others, were talking about this. Tom Malinowski was trying to get the attention of AOL back in 2000 on the same issue. It was only when Tom Lantos started calling hearings, I think in 2005, or Chris Smith, I forget, that it started to change.
And just one small, I think here it's more about the effect of, there's more of a virtuous circle, and the companies can't just be incredibly, agreeing to repression, censorship in one part of the world and agreeing to openness and communication in another, without that being an incredible liability to both trust and brand image. And there, the effect is it forces more openness, not less. And we even talk about this in a related fashion of companies like Clorox or others starting a kind of a green line of products, or because they like the brand part of it. And it's very difficult for a retail company to start one line that's like their own boutique brand that's going to be organic and green, and then they have the rest of their products that are inorganic and non-green, without consumers going, well, wait a minute, what's with that, right? Why you can't do that? And in the same way, it's because of the information is everywhere issue, which you're steeped in. It's very difficult for companies to deal with the brand reputational risk and trust risk of seeming to behave in completely opposite fashions in different parts of the world.
So, Zach, why don't you take your own questions? You don't need to call on people. We'll pass the mic around. We've got about 20 minutes or so, and we'll leave time to decide some folks. I'll stand back up when the time's up.
Sean Hayes with the New America Foundation, the Future Tense Initiative. I was just curious, so you've described a pretty complex trend that has quite a few moving parts to it. And I was wondering what you thought the shelf life of this trend is, and is that shelf life long enough to actually make a substantial difference in terms of the planet's needs vis-a-vis all of the different outputs of sustainability as a culture?
I mean, I think the answer is actually embedded in your question, because some of this is about science and what the carrying capacity of the planet is. And if that's the case, you start to see this is what the planet can provide, this is the number of people we have on it. If we're going to sustain improved living standards, which we've achieved very clearly in the last 25 years, it means things have to change and evolve. So as a movement taking the same shape it has now, I don't know what the shelf life is. As something that's going to be on business's agenda, I think it's here to stay.
You know, on that, and speaking for myself in this, I mean, meaning I don't know if I'm speaking for Aron in this, Malthusian arguments about the unsustainability of the future have been part of our culture, well, at least since the 1790s when Malthus
Since
was writing.
yeah, exactly.
And have always proven to be wrong, either because all things were not equal as a through line into the future, or because innovation in science, you know, managed to arbitrage the problem away. And you know, for all the strength of inconvenient truth and the apocalyptic rhetoric, it actually doesn't work very well with business, right? I mean, you can't really walk in and go, change how you do business, or the oceans are going to boil, your kids are going to die, and the planet's going to fry. I mean, it's not a compelling business argument. It may be a highly depressing human argument, but it's not, you know, and it's out there, right? So if it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. So I don't know the answer to the question, but I'm not as convinced that that was the right way to phrase the problem. Because there are real problems in the present that have to do with cost, availability, supply, and then the costs inherent in creating more supply, whether it's just of stuff, whether it's of ideas, you know, you name it. And that is compelling because it's a real problem in kind of real time that people can grasp, see, and feel that they need to solve. The greater ones, I mean, it's fun to talk about we need 3 Earths if everybody in China buys 2 cars, and that's true. But, you know, the Chinese are sitting around going, we know we're not going to build a world where everybody in China owns 2 cars. So they can buy 14 million cars a year, and they can buy 20 million cars next year. But they're not going to buy 70 million cars in 4 years, or at least they're not going to buy cars known as cars. They're going to buy something that may transport them from. So I guess I'm more optimistic because I'm less sure that the question's the right one, even though it's out there, and I'm not in any way critiquing the asking of it. I'm saying it's out there, it shapes the world that we're in, and that's sort of my take on it. Pat?
You don't speak for me.
Okay.
No, I mean, it's actually, no, it's an important and nuanced point. I mean, I think, I agree that we are not inexorably headed to hell. I think that we've got a changing set of operating environments that, in my view, create a huge opportunity for business. Don't necessarily say that, you know, we're all doomed. And presenting it as a problem, actually, I think, is indeed a problem. So I think we do more or less agree.
We'll work this out.
Yeah.
You know, some
later.
Before the paperback, at least.
That's right.
Thanks, guys. Great presentation. Looking forward to reading the book. I'm Patrick Doherty. I'm the director of the Smart Strategy Initiative here at New America. And we're looking at the strategic implications of sustainability in my project. And so the question to you is, given, you know, 2 of the themes that seem to be running through your presentation, and I presume the book, one of them is that there's a real challenge around commodity prices. And that is massive. That traditionally has been one of the driving strategic issues in the affairs of great powers. Managing that, and certainly is, you know, since the Carter Doctrine in 1980. So that's a big issue, but also the second biggest issue right now in politics is jobs. And you seem to be speaking to that question as well, that this is the source of high-wage, high-skilled jobs going forward. And so if we are in Washington, to what extent is there a compelling state interest here in the sustainability question? And getting to your fourth point, Aron, that you said that the regulatory kind of context is one of the oars that needs to be rowing. There's at least three ways that can happen. One is infrastructure, the way the government can intervene in this. One is providing conducive infrastructure. Another is providing conducive pricing through taxes or incentives. And then the third, I just lost it in my head, but the government can intervene in these multiple ways. What have you seen? To what extent is this a strategic question, given the way you see the trajectory of resource prices and the economy in a status quo kind of context? And then did you see any obvious ways in which the government can facilitate this more sustainable future coming through?
Well, I'll start with the second half of the question. I think the governments are doing a variety of things. A couple things I would add to your list. One is, in some places, governments are changing listing requirements in a way that change what it is companies are asked to do. That's crucially important. South Africa, by the way, is probably as far ahead as anyone on that, so that's really important. Procurement is another thing. Governments buy a lot of products and services, and Walmart, it's widely agreed, creates market terms by its requirements. Government has as much or more opportunity to do that, so that's another area as well. The third is the bully pulpit, and I think getting information out there so that the average person thinks differently about his or her purchases and use of products is also crucially important. And then there's the intergovernmental dimension of this, which hasn't exactly been succeeding like a house on fire, but still is quite relevant, certainly, and there's some potential, and I still hold out hope that will continue to play a role. Now, the thing to remember in all of this is that the line between government and business in the United States is very different than it is in many other parts of the world. So there's some reference to China. There's an agency that oversees the 100 biggest state-owned companies there. That's basically the board of directors of the 100 biggest Chinese companies. So, and they have demanded that Chinese companies take on corporate responsibility. So important also to keep in mind the different ownership structures and indeed social contracts that you find in other parts of the world where some of the answers are a little different. Do you want to take the first half of the question?
I think one thing on the business government that animated us writing the book was because we don't deal a lot with government in the book, which we made a choice not to. From my perspective, part of that was businesses are better off, particularly in the United States, where there's a lot of business blame of government, and claim that government is getting in the way of X, Y, and Z. Really good businesses are much better off just dealing with their issues as if government either isn't there or isn't going to help than they are using government as a kind of approximate excuse. And I think a lot of good companies, more of them don't get into that as much. They're not in the game of government standing in the way. And I'm particularly critical of Wall Street in this, in the degree to which financial institutions have spent a lot of time over the past years, maybe as a defensive posture, saying, well, we would do X, Y, and Z if it weren't for the government. You don't hear Jeff Immelt saying that a lot. And you don't hear Sal Palmisano saying that a lot. In fact, you don't hear them saying it at all. They may think it about certain things, right? But their MO is not one of, if only government would do X, we would just be fine. You hear some resource companies, and Jim Rogers of Duke certainly is more focused on that as a kind of a framework. The jobs, I have a different take on the jobs issue, in part because I think that, that it can cut both ways, frankly. More sustainable businesses are not necessarily businesses that are going to hire more people. In fact, they may hire less people, right? And that's another conundrum about both efficiencies and being well run, is it may require fewer bodies. The flip side is that innovation creates new opportunities and new possibilities.
I think there's no guarantee that embracing new technologies will produce a high volume of high-skill, high-wage jobs, but I think the absence of that means that there will be fewer jobs than there would be otherwise, and that the opportunities are going to be developed elsewhere. So it's a classic case of it doesn't guarantee success if you do it, but it guarantees failure if you don't.
And the commodity input price question, is it strategic?
Yeah, I mean, although what's striking in the world today is, in spite of that, it hasn't created the kind of global dislocations politically that it did in a lot of the 20th century, and that may be because it's against the backdrop of rising global affluence rather than declining global affluence. So it's one thing when you have rising prices in an environment of increasing wealth and security versus rising prices in a world of more zero sum. So my take on that is that the ability of companies in particular to create more, even with this, to satisfy those needs has been an offset to the strategic tensions that's tended to play out. So all this sort of talk about coming water wars or coming resource wars or China trying to lock up resources are understandable given the experience of the past 100 to 200 years, but at least for now don't seem to be playing out that way. And I think that, again, just has to do with we live in a world of rising affluence, in spite of the fact we may live in a world of declining relative affluence in the United States. And then we'll go back there. Up here.
Thank you. My name is Oliver Scardo. Most of the corporations you mentioned are big corporations that have a lot of exposure anyways. A lot of analysts covering them and a lot of journalists. But how can small and medium-sized corporations be held accountable to their decisions if there's not a lot of observation of them in the media or in general?
I mean, smaller companies are held accountable in the marketplace every day because they live much closer to the edge in terms of continuing on. The other thing is there's virtually no small company that's not part of a broader global supply chain. And so with that in mind, there are a lot of big companies who ask a lot of small companies. So it may not be the public, it may not be regulators in the same way, but there's actually a powerful business-to-business mechanism that ends up changing the terms on which small and medium-sized companies do business.
Yeah, I mean, we do talk about smaller companies in the book. We certainly do not talk about, what would be classically termed a small business. But I mean, that's where Aron's point about they're all sort of part of a chain where they have to deal with these issues. So even if you're running a small company in, Keokuk, which is in Iowa, by the way, you have to deal with some of the same issues. Accountability, obviously different if you're a 10-person organization in a small town. Then your accountability is likely to your local environment. There was a question back there, if there's still a question back there.
Hi, I'll do my best here. In terms of the move towards sustainability for business, it seems that environmental degradation is not compelling for business, but resources are limited. I wonder, how much that's a factor in the shift towards sustainability. It looks to me like business will continue to extract natural resources until they're gone. The oil sands, for example, there's a certain number of years where, the extraction of energy is becoming more expensive, but at which point it becomes too expensive, they'll leave that last little bit alone. Are they not thinking into the future? It seems there needs to be a serious shift in how we live. And now I want to take it to Obama and the stimulus package, of which a great percentage of it is earmarked for helping to create green energy, for example, infrastructure in the U.S., and a lot of grants and incentives for business are being provided. Is this something business needs, or is this just a free sort of handout for them? Because it seems to me that if they really wanted to do that, they could, or is the cost of change just too high? So if it's a matter of change, is the stimulus actually going to assist business to make these changes?
I mean, I would say on the second part of that, a lot of the stimulus that went toward the more green, alternate, new infrastructure didn't go to a lot of these larger organizations that themselves do have R&D budgets to spend on that. They went toward more venture, early stage, where either the Wall Street marketplace of private equity or private capital or the public marketplace wasn't actually providing those kind of funds to those kinds of ideas and innovations. It didn't really go to Honeywell or Caterpillar to develop more efficient earth movers. So I think it was more carefully designed than that. On the latter, no, companies don't care about these things, right? And the way corporations have evolved is a fairly amoral one. I mean, that's a highly debatable point, but I don't mean immoral or moral, just sort of value neutral about things like that. And that's been the argument of environmental movements and legislation in Europe and in the United States, that you need to force companies by virtue of law to have to take financial account of what have traditionally been externalities in terms of effects on the environment. But what's interesting about the global supply chain phenomenon, as well as the rising resource one, as well as a myriad of global regulations which are not in harmony. We talked before about companies need to respond to openness much more than they need to respond to closedness. Meaning, if they're open in lots of the world and closed in others, the closed part's more of a problem than the openness in terms of reputational. If Japan has very stringent regulations about emissions and you're a global business and a global supply chain, better to just retool your entire supply chain to meet Japan, because it's a lot more costly to try to do it bespoke to each different regulatory regime. We had this issue in the United States of California trying to force a higher standard of energy efficiency for cars, and a lot of car makers, legitimately oppose this, saying California is de facto forcing a national standard, because to really meet this, we have to make all of our vehicles do it, not just California. So I think because of the nature of the world today, no, companies don't care about the cost of oil sands, and they're not thinking ahead in that way. But I'm trying to make the point of they are forced to deal with these issues much more than they used to by the world as it's becoming than they ever have been, even though they have not woken up and developed a kind of a moral mission at the core of their operating charter.
So it's...
Yeah.
Well, there's no, it's not written anywhere that ExxonMobil should or will exist 50 years from now. And I think if the world changes in fundamental ways, we know that some of the biggest businesses that are around today may cease to exist or look very different. The last 100 years tell us exactly the same thing. Just ask the CEO of America's largest retailer, Woolworths. So I think companies... This gets into a philosophical debate about the purpose of the firm, and companies exist to deliver value and return, value for customers, return to investors, and so on. And is every company today set to face the world 50 years from now? Absolutely not. I think our point is the companies that think with that in mind are a lot likelier to do well, arguably in the short run, absolutely in the medium and long run.
So it's my hypothesis that it's in both your amoral and your moral interest to leave some time to sign some books.
Yes.
And sell some books.
Yes.
So why don't we wrap it up there? Please give our speakers a round of applause. And they will be outside with the books momentarily.